cold that comes from inside. February laid its hand across the Flint Hills like a punishment nobody had earned. Frost climbed the cabin walls before dawn, white and quiet and thick as funeral lace, and the wind came low and mean through the tall grass, carrying nothing but cold and the smell of frozen earth that hadn't seen a plow in months. The stove fought its war against the dark and lost most nights, and by morning the water in the basin wore a skin of ice thin as scripture paper. Outside, the hills rolled on forever under a sky the color of old lead, and nothing moved except the wind and the cattle standing huddled against the barn like mourners who'd forgotten what they were mourning. Now, there are questions in this world that don't come with answers. Some of them you carry around like stones in your pocket and learn to walk with the weight. And some of them a child sets right down on your kitchen table beside the oatmeal, plain as sunshine, and you just sit there staring at it, knowing you ain't got a blessed thing to say. Jesse Cain rose before first light the way he always did. His boots hit the cold floor, and his breath came out white, and he didn't pause to think about it, because thinking was a luxury poor ranchers couldn't afford in February. He fed the stove, cracked ice on the water trough with the heel of an axe, forked hay for the 12 head of cattle that stood steaming in the dark. Used to be 20 head. The Flint Hills didn't forgive a poor man his mistakes, and Kansas winter forgave nobody at all. Back inside, he set the oatmeal to boil. Rosie's dress hung over the chair back where he'd patched it by candlelight the night before, a square of blue calico stitched over the torn elbow. His work clumsy but tight. The thread pulled too hard in places because his hands were built for fence wire and leather, not cotton and needle. He'd braided her hair last night, too, his rough fingers working through the tangles while she sat patient on the stool, humming some tune she'd learned from the Henderson girl at church. She never complained about the pulling. She just hummed and waited. And sometimes that patience of hers cut him worse than any wind. She was 6 years old and had her mama's jaw and her mama's half smile. And some mornings, that was more than Jesse could stand to look at. Rosie came to the table rubbing her eyes, barefoot on the cold planks. She climbed into her chair and pulled the oatmeal bowl close with both hands and blew on it. And for a while, the only sound was the stove ticking and the spoon scraping and the wind leaning steady on the walls outside. Then she looked up, her eyes brown, serious, clear as creek water, found his across the table. "Papa, how come we ain't got a mama like the Hendersons?" Jesse's hand stopped halfway to his coffee cup. He set it down real careful, like the handle might crack under the weight of the question. Across the table sat the empty chair, the one nobody sat in, the one he never moved and never talked about and never looked at directly, the one that took up more space in this cabin than any piece of pine furniture had a right to. His throat worked. He managed something, but it came out wrong. "We do just fine, Rosie girl." His voice didn't sound right, not even to him. Rosie studied his face the way children do, not judging, not pushing, just seeing what was there with those clear brown eyes. And then she nodded once and went back to her oatmeal, already moved on, already humming. Jesse washed the bowls in the basin after, his hands deep in water so cold it made his knuckles ache, and the question hung in the cabin like wood smoke with nowhere to go. He dried his hands on the towel and looked at the empty chair and looked away and went outside to break more ice. The wind didn't have an answer either. Third pew, close to the door, Sunday at the Cottonwood Creek Church. Jesse sat where he always sat, third pew, left side, close to the door, for quick leaving. Rosie pressed warm against his arm, with her boots dangling above the plank floor, and her eyes roaming slow across the congregation, counting every family that looked like a family was supposed to look. The Hendersons sat up front. Sam Henderson had his arm across the back of the pew behind his wife Margaret, and Margaret had a way of smoothing her daughter's hair during the sermon that made it look like the most natural gesture God ever invented. Jesse watched that hand move gentle, absent, certain, and felt something pull tight behind his ribs like a rope that had no give left in it. Folks in Cottonwood Creek were decent about it, had been from the start. The widows brought casseroles that first year after Eleanor passed, covered dishes, carried up the road with careful hands and careful sympathy. And Jesse returned, everyone washed clean, with a nod and a much obliged that shut the door quiet but firm before anyone could step through. After a while, they stopped bringing the casseroles. After a while, they just watched him from a respectful distance, the way you watch a man carrying something too heavy and figure he'd rather collapse under it than set it down in front of witnesses. After service, folks gathered in the yard the way they did, breath coming out white, children chasing to between the wagons. Jesse was steering Rosie toward the road when the new widow stepped into their path. Mrs. Anna Lindquist, come down from Minnesota 2 months prior, settled into the old Perkins cottage at the edge of town, quiet woman with calm gray eyes and flour dust on her cuffs from baking for the church social. She wasn't young and she wasn't old. She was somewhere in the territory between, a place where sorrow had drawn the softness out of a face but left the kindness in it. She carried herself like a woman who'd already buried what mattered most and decided the only direction left was forward. She didn't approach Jesse. She knelt down to Rosie, right there in the churchyard, and her skirt pressed into the frozen mud without her seeming to notice or care. "That's a fine dress you're wearing. Did you sew that patch yourself?" Rosie shook her head. Her mittened hand found Jesse's trouser leg. "My papa done it." Anna looked at the crooked calico square, the pulled thread, the uneven stitches, the obvious effort of a man who didn't know what he was doing, but did it anyway, and something softened in her face. Not pity. Something closer to recognition. "Well, He did a brave job of it. She smiled at Rosie, easy and unhurried. How'd you like to learn proper sewing? I could teach you after school, if your papa allows. Rosie's face lit up like a lantern. Somebody had finally thought to strike a match to. She turned to Jesse with her whole body, both hands clasped, eyes wide. Jesse heard himself say, "That'd be fine," before he had time to think better of it. The words just fell out, and once they were on the ground between them, there was no picking 'em back up. Walking home on the frozen road, Rosie skipped 3 steps ahead, chattering about thread colors and what she'd sew first, and whether Miss Anna would let her use the good scissors. Jessie watched the back of her head, the crooked braid, the patched dress, the small boots kicking up frost, and felt the crack from the oatmeal question widen another inch inside his chest. "Papa, what color thread should I pick?" He looked out across the Flint Hills, gray and endless, and he didn't know how to answer that either. The vow he made in the rain that night. After Rosie was tucked in, and the cabin had gone to its particular brand of quiet, the kind that has weight to it, the kind that settles on a man's shoulders like a second coat, Jesse sat by the stove, mending a fence strap, and let his mind drift where he didn't usually permit it to go. The fever came in the spring of '81, 3 days. That's all it took to change everything. 3 days of Eleanor burning up in their bed. Her skin so hot it didn't feel like skin anymore, while Rosie barely too young to understand anything, except that Mama wouldn't pick her up, sat on the kitchen floor, stacking spoons into little towers and knocking 'em down again. Jesse remembered the sound of those spoons hitting the floor, mixed with Eleanor's breathing, and how the rain hammered the cabin roof so hard it sounded like the sky itself was trying to come inside. The doctor rode out from Council Grove on the 3rd morning. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and rain running off his coat onto the floorboards. And Jesse knew from the way the man couldn't meet his eyes that he'd come to deliver something he couldn't take back. By afternoon, Eleanor's hand had gone still on the quilt, and the rain kept falling, like it didn't know the world had changed. He buried her on the hill behind the ranch, in the mud, with Rosie on his hip and water running down both their faces. And he made a vow standing there in the wet grass with his boots sinking into the earth, not to God, not to Eleanor, but to the only person he had left to make promises to, which was himself. He would be enough. He would raise this girl with his own 2 hands and need no one and let no one close enough to be lost again. Jesse looked down at his hands now, holding the fence strap loose in his lap, the same hands that had closed Eleanor's eyes, the same hands that braided Rosie's hair every night and patched her dresses by candlelight and broke ice every morning on a water trough. Strong hands, useful hands, hands that could fix nearly anything on this ranch, except the one thing that was actually broken. He stood and walked the cabin slow, checked the door latch, pulled Rosie's blanket up where it had slipped. Then he stood in the front room and felt the draft cold air pushing through gaps in the north wall. he'd never bothered to patch. Mud chinkin' crumbled out, boards warped with age. The cabin was falling apart so gradually he'd stopped noticing. The way a man stops noticing his own loneliness once it's been there long enough. From the bedroom, small as a breath, Rosie murmured in her sleep, one word, just one. Anna. Jesse stood in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind find every gap he'd left unrepaired. Wednesday was coming, whether he was ready or not. Thread and apple cake. Anna arrived Wednesday afternoon carrying a sewing basket in one hand and warm apple cake wrapped in blue cloth in the other. She stepped into the cabin the way water fills a vessel, natural, unhurried, taking the shape of the space without ever claiming it. The cold followed her through the door, and then the door closed and the cold stayed outside, and Anna stayed in. And just like that, the room was different. I brought a few things for Rosie to start with. She set the basket on the table, unfolding the cloth to reveal needles, spools of thread in 4 colors, a pincushion shaped like a strawberry, and fabric scraps sorted by weight. Nothing fancy, just enough to get her hands learning. Much obliged. Ma'am? Jesse reached for his hat on the peg. I'll be in the barn. You need anything? He escaped to the cold and the familiar smell of hay and leather and horse sweat. And he told himself it was because the harness needed mending, but the harness sat untouched on its hook, while Jesse stood at the frost-covered window, one hand on the sill, watching what was happening inside his house. Rosie held the needle like it was a live thing that might turn on her. Her small fingers couldn't find the grip, and her tongue poked out the corner of her mouth with the effort of it. Anna didn't correct her, didn't take the needle back. She placed her own hands over Rosie's, steady over clumsy, patient over eager, and guided the thread through the fabric in a slow, even pull. There, Anna said. See, the cloth tells you where it wants the needle. You just gotta listen. And then Rosie laughed, not a polite laugh, not a careful one, a head-back, full-body laugh that shook her shoulders and crinkled her nose and rang through the window glass and crossed the frozen yard and hit Jesse square in the chest. He hadn't heard that sound, that particular, reckless, unburdened sound in months. His hands went still at his sides. Come supper time. Rosie insisted on 3 places at the table. Jesse didn't argue. He set the plates while Rosie pulled Anna by the hand to the chair, the empty chair, the one nobody sat in, the one that had been Eleanor's, and Anna sat down in it without knowing what it meant. And Jesse looked at her sitting there and felt something shift beneath his feet, like the ground had moved an inch to the left. The stew was same as always, but the apple cake was something else, warm and sweet and heavy with cinnamon, the kind of food that fills more than just a stomach. It was the first thing another person had cooked in this kitchen since the fever took Eleanor, and Jesse ate 2 slices and said absolutely nothing about it. Anna talked easy while they ate. She spoke about the fabric mill in St. Paul, where she used to buy thread before her move to Kansas, about how her mother had taught her that every stitch was a kind of patience made visible. Rosie listened with her chin propped in both hands, oatmeal forgotten, eyes wide as windows. After Anna gathered her basket and said her goodbyes, Rosie placed her first sampler on the kitchen table like a soldier laying down a medal. The stitches were crooked and uneven. The red thread spelled ROSIE in letters that leaned every which direction. It was the most beautiful thing Jesse had seen in a long time. He studied it after Rosie fell asleep, running his thumb over the bumpy thread. Then he washed Anna's cake plate. He could return it Sunday. He set it on the shelf beside Eleanor's things, moved it to the counter, back to the shelf. He stood there holding the plate for a full minute, and then he set it on the counter and left it there and went to bed without looking at it again. The way Tuesdays changed. Here's something you ought to know about the way love works when it comes to people who've been alone a long time. It don't ride in on a fast horse. It don't announce itself with thunder or make grand speeches on the front porch. Most times it just shows up on a Tuesday afternoon carrying apple cake wrapped in blue cloth, and before you know it, the whole shape of your week has rearranged itself around a knock on the door. Week after week, Anna came. The lessons moved from Wednesday to Tuesday, one day closer to Sunday, as if the space between visits had stretched too long for Rosie to bear, and she'd willed the calendar to bend. Anna brought patience every time, and laughter, and that warm apple cake in its blue cloth. And every Tuesday, the cabin seemed to hold its breath a little less when the door opened. Rosie's stitches improved by degrees. The sampler became a handkerchief. The handkerchief became the uneven start of an apron with a pocket she insisted on adding herself, even though the pocket sat crooked as a barn door in a windstorm. She chattered while she sewed about the Henderson girl's cat that had kittens under the porch, about whether birds got cold feet in winter, about the ice forming patterns on the creek that looked like lace, and Anna answered every question like it was the most important thing she'd heard all day. Jesse found himself doing things he couldn't quite explain, sweeping the cabin floor on Monday nights, straightening the chairs, setting out the good coffee tin instead of the everyday one. One Tuesday, Anna paused at the north wall and ran her hand along the chinking. "You've got quite a draft here," she said, just once. Casual as mentioning weather. He patched it that night after she left, packed fresh mud between the boards and tamped it tight. For Rosie, he told himself, just keeping the cold out for Rosie. By the third week, a pattern had formed. Anna would arrive. The lesson would begin, and Jesse would step out to the porch with 2 tin cups of coffee, one for himself, and one he'd set on the rail, steaming into the cold air. And somewhere in that 3rd week, without announcement or invitation, Anna came out and took the 2nd cup. She wrapped both hands around it and stood beside him, and they looked out at the Flint Hills together. They talked about cattle prices, the cost of feed in Council Grove, whether the winter wheat would survive the freeze. Ordinary things, the kind of talk that don't mean much by itself. But Jesse noticed he didn't step sideways when Anna's elbow nearly brushed his on the rail, and she didn't move away either, and the steam from both cups rose and tangled together in the cold air between them. "My husband was a farmer up in Minnesota," Anna said one Tuesday, her eyes on the hills. "Good man. Lars, pneumonia took him last March." Her thumb moved slow across the rim of the cup, back and forth, the only sign that the words cost her something to say. "Some mornings I still pour 2 cups of coffee before I remember." She didn't compare her grief to his, didn't ask him to share his. She just let him know she understood the shape of the empty space a person leaves behind, and they stood together in the quiet after, and neither one of them needed to fill it with words. That evening, Rosie hung her newest sampler in the window where the morning light would catch it first thing. Jesse saw it when he came in from feeding the stock. The crooked stitches spelled ANNA in red thread, each letter leaning toward the next like they were holding hands. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. The empty bucket. The freeze came hard on a Thursday night, vicious and sudden, and took 2 calves before dawn. Jesse found 'em in the east pasture in the gray half-light, stiff and frost-covered. Their mothers standing over 'em with breath coming out in white plumes that rose and vanished and rose again like something that refused to stop hoping. He dragged the bodies to the fence line alone, his hands cracking and bleeding against the frozen hides. And by the time he stumbled back to the cabin, the sun was up and the sky was the color of old iron, and he had nothing left inside him except cold. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the tin box where he kept the ranch money, counted the coins twice, counted them a 3rd time because the number couldn't be right, except it was. 2 calves gone meant a month of feed money gone with him, and the column of figures in his head wouldn't add up to anything but trouble no matter how many times he ran 'em. He was still sitting there when Anna arrived Tuesday at the usual time, basket in hand. Rosie already at the table with her thread laid out and her eyes bright. Not today. Jesse stood in the doorway, filling it. His voice came out flat and rough as rusted fence wire. "Rosie's got chores need doing. Reckon we ought to skip this week." Anna looked at him. She held the basket handle with both hands and her gray eyes searched his face. And for just a moment something crossed her expression, not hurt, exactly, but the careful stillness of a woman who recognized what she was seeing because she'd built the same kind of walls herself once and knew what they looked like from the outside. She didn't argue, didn't ask what happened. She just nodded, slow and dignified, and said, "You know where to find me, Jesse," and turned and walked back down the frozen road with her shoulders straight and her back unbowed. And the quiet way she left was worse than if she'd slammed the door behind her, because it meant she understood exactly what he was doing and was choosing not to fight it. Rosie cried that night, not the loud kind of crying that demands attention, the other kind, the kind that shakes a child's shoulders in the dark and comes out almost silent, muffled into a pillow, the kind that sounds like a small person trying very hard not to be a burden. Jesse sat on the porch step in the bitter cold and listened through the wall and couldn't make himself go inside because he had no idea what to say to a girl whose happiness he'd just sent walking down the road. By the door sat the water bucket. The freeze had gotten deep inside it. Water expanded into ice, and the ice had split the wood along the grain, cracking it open from within. The bucket sat on the porch board like an accusation, broken apart, holding exactly nothing, empty, frozen solid, destroyed by what it had tried to contain. Jesse picked it up and turned it in his hands, ran his thumb along the crack where the grain had given way. He didn't need anyone to tell him what he was looking at. He set the ruined bucket by the barn. When he came back to the cabin, moving quiet past Rosie's door, he saw through the gap that she'd taken the ANNA sampler down from the window and folded it careful and put it inside her pillowcase, pressed flat against the cotton, hidden away where nobody could take it from her. That was worse than the crying. What the wind carried up the hill. 3 days passed, and the cabin turned into a kind of silence Jesse hadn't known before. Not the old silence, the one he'd grown comfortable in, the one that had been his companion for 4 years and asked nothing of him. This was different. This silence had a shape to it. It knew exactly what was missing, and it sat in every corner and on every chair and in the space between his words and Rosie's, filling the room with the outline of something that had been there and wasn't anymore. Rosie didn't ask about Anna. That was the worst part. She ate her oatmeal in the morning and did her small chores and went to bed without complaint. And she moved through the cabin with a quietness that looked exactly like Jesse's quietness, careful, contained, asking for nothing, and seeing his own kind of grief settled into a 6-year-old's body was the thing that finally broke him open like that water bucket on the porch. She left her supper half-eaten on Thursday, just pushed the bowl away and said, "I ain't very hungry, Papa," in a voice so polite and small that Jesse had to set his jaw to keep from coming apart right there at the table. Saturday afternoon, he told Rosie he'd be back before dark and walked up the hill behind the ranch. Eleanor's grave sat beneath a limestone marker he'd carved himself 4 years ago. The letters, shallow and uneven, because his hands had been shaken so bad when he cut 'em that the chisel slipped twice and he'd had to start the L over. The tall grass grew thick around it, brown and frozen now, bending in the wind that came ceaseless across the Flint Hills like it had been blowing since before there were people here to feel it. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air smelled of ice and distance. He knelt in the cold grass and pressed his hand flat against the stone and closed his eyes and spoke to her, not out loud, in the deep part of his chest where words don't need sound. He told her he was scared, told her Rosie needed more than one pair of rough hands could give, no matter how many dresses those hands patched, or how many braids they tied, or how many mornings they broke ice on the trough. He told her about the woman named Anna, who came on Tuesdays with a sewing basket and apple cake, and about how Rosie laughed when Anna was in the kitchen, that particular reckless, unguarded laugh, and how the sound of it had rearranged something inside the cabin walls that Jesse hadn't built and couldn't tear down and didn't. If he was honest with himself in this frozen grass before God and Eleanor and nobody else, didn't want to anymore. Here's what Jesse couldn't admit. Even kneeling at that stone with the wind cutting through his coat and his hand flat on the cold limestone, he wasn't afraid of loving again. He was afraid he already did, had been, for weeks. Maybe since the first Tuesday, Anna took the coffee cup off the porch rail and stood beside him without saying a word, and the silence between 'em felt like the first warm thing he'd known since the fever. He stayed a long time. The wind moved through the tall grass around the grave, and it sounded like breathing, slow and steady, the way Eleanor used to breathe when she was sleeping and the world was still good, walking back down the hill. Jesse looked toward the cabin and stopped. The window. Rosie had put the sampler back. She must have pulled it from inside her pillowcase and hung it up again while he was gone, those crooked red letters. ANNA, catching the last low winter light like a flag she refused to take down. A child stubborn, imperfect, unbreakable hope, hung in a window for the whole empty prairie to see. Jesse stood in the yard with the wind dying around him and looked at those letters until his eyes burned. He went inside, knelt to where Rosie sat on the kitchen floor with her picture book, her small face turned up to him, waiting. "How'd you like to invite Miss Anna for Valentine's Day supper?" Her whole face changed. The smile came so fast and so bright it was like watching a match strike in a dark room. "Can I make something special for her, Papa?" Jesse touched her hair, smoothed the braid he'd tied that morning. "Make whatever your heart tells you, Rosie girl." 2 paper hearts. Valentine's Day came in cold, but the light was different. longer at the edges, softer, as if February had finally remembered it was supposed to be heading somewhere warmer and had taken the first reluctant step. Rosie sat at the kitchen table all afternoon with the red paper Anna had brought weeks ago, a pair of blunt scissors, and a concentration so fierce her tongue pressed into the corner of her mouth and stayed there. She cut 2 hearts, careful, lopsided, and beautiful in the particular way that only a child's handwork can be, where the imperfection is the whole point. On one she wrote Papa in big wobbly letters that leaned left. On the other she wrote Miss Anna in letters that leaned right, as if even the words were trying to reach toward each other across the table. Jesse cooked, stew with the last of the winter carrots and fresh biscuits from a recipe he'd practiced twice that week when Rosie wasn't watching. He set 3 places at the table, 3 tin plates, 3 cups, 3 forks laid straight on the scrubbed pine. He stepped back and looked at the arrangement, and his chest went tight. 3 place settings, where for 4 years there'd been 2, and the 3rd plate sat there on the wood, as simple and as terrifying as any leap of faith he'd ever taken. Anna arrived at 5 o'clock with apple cake balanced in one hand and a small bundle wrapped in muslin in the other. She stepped through the door and stopped. Her eyes moved across the 3 settings, the biscuits on the board, the lamp Jesse had cleaned and trimmed so it burned clear and bright. Something moved through her face, quick and unguarded, the way light passes through a window before you can catch it. She blinked once, hard, and then she smiled, and the smile was not calm or patient or careful. It was the first true smile Jesse had seen from her, and it changed her whole face. And he understood in that moment that Anna Lindquist had been holding herself together with the same kind of quiet discipline he had, and that this table with its 3 plates had cracked her open the same way Rosie's question had cracked him. Rosie, I brought you something. Anna knelt and unwrapped a small embroidered handkerchief, stitched in the corner with a tiny pink rose, every petal perfect. Every seamstress needs a proper one of her own. Rosie held it in both hands like it was spun from gold and looked up at Anna with those clear brown eyes and said, "It's the prettiest thing I ever had." Supper was warm. Rosie talked enough for all 3 of them about the Henderson girls' new kittens and the ice breaking up on the creek and the bird she'd seen sitting on the fence post that morning like it was waiting for spring, same as everybody else. Anna laughed, and Jesse found himself laughing back, and the sound of their laughter together filled the cabin in a way the stove heat never had, reaching into the corners and the cracks and the cold places along the north wall he'd finally patched. After supper, Rosie climbed down from her chair and stood up straight and held both hearts high, one in each hand, arms stretched wide, like she was holding the 2 halves of something that had always belonged together. "See, Papa." Her voice rang clear as a church bell in the warm room. Now we got enough love for everybody. The cabin went still, the stove ticked, the lamp burned steady. Jesse looked at Anna across the table, and Anna looked back at him, and her eyes were bright and full, and neither of 'em spoke because there was nothing left to say that the moment wasn't already saying louder than words ever could. Rosie stood between 'em, holding two paper hearts like she'd just solved the oldest and simplest problem in the world. And maybe she had. Anna helped Rosie into her coat at the door. Jesse walked them to the porch. The night was cold and still, and the stars were out fierce and close. The way Kansas stars burn when the air is clear and the wind has finally laid down. Anna turned. Jesse looked at her, in the starlight really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at anyone in 4 years, and said, quiet, like a man remembering a language he thought he'd forgotten, "Same time next Tuesday." Anna's hand rested on the porch rail. She didn't move it closer, and she didn't pull it away. Same time next Tuesday. Jesse. The answer that didn't need words. Mornin' came the way it always had. Gray light easing through the window glass. Stove needin' its first feedin'. Oatmeal on the burner, startin' its slow bubble. Same cabin. Same kitchen. Same February. But the empty chair held Anna's folded apron. She'd left it draped across the seat the night before, flour dusted and soft, and Jesse hadn't moved it. It sat there quiet, as a promise not replacing what had been, but filling what had been empty, which was a different thing entirely, and the only kind of healing that was honest. Jesse braided Rosie's hair. His hands were the same as they'd always been, a cattleman's hands, cracked across the knuckles, calloused from fence wire and axe handles, and 4 years of doing everything alone. But this morning they moved different. The braid came out straighter than usual. The part was even, and when his rough fingers caught a tangle, Rosie hummed through it, a tune Anna had taught her, something slow and gentle that Jesse didn't recognize by name, but already knew by heart. The way you know a song that's been playing in the next room long enough to become part of the air. He poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit before his mind caught up to what his hands were doing. He stood at the counter holding the second cup, steam rising off the dark surface, and for a moment he was perfectly still. Then he carried it to the table and set it across from his own place and let it sit there, steaming quiet in the morning light beside the chair where the apron waited. Rosie ate her oatmeal and didn't ask any questions. She didn't need to. The sampler hung in the window, ANN, hay catching the early light the way it had every morning since she'd put it back. And the 2 paper hearts sat on the table between the coffee cups, red as cardinals against the pale pine, one leaning left and one leaning right, and both of 'em resting there like they'd found exactly where they were supposed to be. Jesse cleared the dishes and lifted Rosie onto his hip and carried her to the porch. The Flint Hills stretched out before them under a sky that had changed still winter, still Kansas, still February, but the light was longer now, softer at the edges, leaning towards something that hadn't arrived yet but was coming, sure as seasons turn, sure as frozen ground remembers how to grow. Down by the fence post, where the cracked water bucket used to sit, a single crocus had pushed through the frozen earth, purple as a bruise, small as a child's thumb, stubborn and tender and entirely unafraid. It had no business being there in February, but there it was, growing anyway. You know, the hardest questions in this life don't really need answers. They just need someone brave enough to stop holding the door shut and let the morning come inside. Jesse set Rosie down on the porch and leaned against the door frame. Behind him, the cabin was warm. The stove ticked its steady rhythm. 2 coffee cups steamed on a table beside 2 paper hearts, and an apron waited in a chair that wasn't empty anymore, and a child's crooked red stitches caught the light in a window that used to look out on nothing but prairie and sky and the long gray weight of being alone. Papa. Rosie tugged his sleeve. She looked up at him with Eleanor's brown eyes and Anna's patience and her own particular, unshakable hope. Is Miss Anna coming Tuesday? Jesse Cain looked out across the thawing hills, where the tall grass bent in a wind that had gone gentle for the first time in weeks, and he felt something ease inside his chest, not a cracking this time, but a settling, like a house that had finally found its foundation. He smiled. Yeah, Rosie girl, she is. The cabin door stood open behind them. Morning light poured across the kitchen floor, wide and warm and unhurried, and it touched everything: the table, the cups, the paper hearts, the apron in the chair, the sampler in the window, and nothing in that small house on the Flint Hills was cold anymore.